Welcome to this video presentation. I've decided to call it Distributed Learning. During the course Connectiveness and Connective Learning 2011, our facilitators Stephen Downes and George Siemens has during the Friday sessions discussed the different perspective of the course content. I have picked out part of the recordings where they actually take up ideas about distributed learning. So first of all, let's look at what the theory of connectiveness, how they can express this type of learning. The theory proposes that knowledge is contained not merely in the bits of information transmitted to and from as content and creation, but in the way these contents and the people that create them link together. So let's start with Steve Downes explaining how this distributed learning needs to have a bit of a focus and be situated in your own learning.
And it's not simply about confusing you and then getting you to sort things out for yourself, because that's probably not the best way to go. What it is it's about enabling each person to have their own distinct perspective on the material. So we throw a lot of stuff out there, but what we want you to do is select what seems to be most appropriate for you. It's at your level, it accords with your interests, it's not violating any of your background beliefs, and focus on that.
Okay, so we have a focus. Now we need to see how do we interact with other participants and information sources. So back to Stephen again.
But what you do when you're focusing is you're creating your own distinct perspective. And what happens is, when you go into the discussions, whether on somebody else's blog or whether in the discussion supported by Grasshopper, you're bringing your own perspective and you're meeting with a bunch of people who have read different things, not the same things.
So we interact from our own perspective with other people. Now, how does this affect our understanding?
And it's from the interaction of these multiple perspectives and the connections that you make between elements of those multiple perspectives that new understandings, new ways of seeing the material arise.
So from multiple perspectives, we actually have a new understanding. And now, what are the actual activities we engage ourselves in?
And the way I prefer to describe it is a four-part process: aggregation, remix, repurpose, feed forward. And here the key core parts are the remix and the repurpose.
That's an example of 4 activities in distributed learning. Let's now listen in this remix and repurpose and see more specific what that involves.
The remix is the bringing together of things from different elements. The repurpose is everything from using your own vocabulary, your own jargon, incorporating your own background, telling the story from your own perspective or point of view, putting yourself into whatever it is.
So, this is learner-centered education, and now Steve Downes will conclude what we said so far and how we develop this type of new knowledge.
Well, it's not just you look at a bunch of stuff and magically you begin to become aware. Find a perspective, narrow in on that perspective, then take part in the discussion. And it's through that process, the creating of a perspective and then the interacting of that perspective with the whole, that new knowledge is created, part of which you'll be able to partake in.
So this type of learning can seem quite uncontrolled and without structure. And to get on top of this, George Siemens suggests that we need to look at validation of knowledge.
In that regard is once you've defined those perspectives of learning, then the next component that you consider is how do you then validate those views of learning? I mean, what's the research methodology that you begin to use in proving or supporting the assertions that are being put forward around connectivism?
So that is the question, and I would say the answer is what is produced has to have some sort of value. So let's look at this honeycomb model. The value can be divided into that it has to be useful, desirable, accessible, credible, findable, and usable. So this is very hard to all agree on one idea of value, but we don't need consensus, so let's listen to Stephen discussing this again.
Right, we don't need consensus. And that's really important for two reasons. First of all, we are never going to get consensus. And secondly, because your communication with me is always through the medium of words, or in our multimedia environment, shared pictures, concepts, or ideas.
So we are now at the stage where we are communicating our understanding, but it's important that the only place where it has certain value or be usable is in a certain environment.
Learning proceeds by exposure to environment, by immersion in an environment. And the dark side of that is if you immerse yourself in an unhealthy environment, there's a whole range of dysfunctional environments which act against learning.
So in distributed learning, we need to choose which environments that are supporting our learning. And the next thing is also something called pruning our connections. So back to Stephen again.
I think there's some very important elements about pruning these connections. It's it's you expressing your determination of what you want to learn and what you don't want to learn by altering your exposure to phenomena related to that learning.
So one way of exposing you to this type of phenomena will be to put yourself in a course. And if you do that, you also need to look in at what is learning.
Learning might be the formation of a new connection or the deletion of an existing connection, or it may be the increasing or the decreasing of the weight of a connection.
So I think we now reached a situation where distributed learning can be described as learning in a network, and that's where these connections are occurring. So let's go back to Stephen again.
Prior to learning, your network was in one state, and then after learning, your network was in another state.
Okay, so now we have an idea of distributive learning from the connectivist perspective. That's all for now, and thank you for this time. Goodbye.